Hi there and welcome to another Bug Bites tutorial. In this tutorial we're going to build a live sports application where results are updated in real time on the front end of our application. We're going to use Django on the back end and we're going to use HTMX on the front end to poll that Django back end for updated results. So the page we're going to build is going to look something similar to this, where we have a bunch of results, and these can be updated when you run a manage.py script called result generator. We're going to build that later on, but for now let me show you how it will work. When you run that script, HTMX is going to poll the backend, and this script is going to update the results. You can see some of the scores are changing. Sometimes games are marked as full time as well. We're going to see how that works on the backend later on, but the idea is we can simulate a real match day where scores are updating in real time and you don't need to refresh the page to see that. So we're going to see how to build that in this tutorial. We have a starter project on GitHub. This contains a requirements file and we're using Django of course and Django extensions. We also use Django HTMX. When you clone this starting repository, make sure you run pip install -r requirements.txt and that'll install those packages. We also have a few other things set up in our settings.py file. We're using Django HTMX here, and we're using the middleware as well within the middleware setting. So Django HTMX is a library that adds an HTMX attribute to your request object. We're going to see more about how we're going to use that soon. And we have standard things set up in a Django project. We have a urls.py file that includes the app URLs, and we also have our static URLs set up so that we can reference CSS and JavaScript files if we need them. And on top of that we have a scores application, a Django app within our project, and we have a templates directory set up with some simple templates. We have the skeleton for a manage.py command that we're going to build that will load teams, and we also have a simple view here that renders one of those templates. So that's the starter project. Clone that, install the requirements, and you should be good to go. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to create the database models that we're going to use in this application. So if we cross to models.py, I'm going to paste in these models here just so we can keep this quick. Now the models we're going to use, let me get rid of that. We have a tournament model which contains the name of the tournament, and it's just going to be one tournament in this application, the English Premier League. We also have a team model which contains the name of a team within the tournament. And finally we have a fixture model here. Now this is the important model in our application. It contains a link to which tournament the fixture is in. It contains foreign keys to the home and the away team in the fixture. And it also contains positive small integer fields that reference how many goals the home team and the away team have scored. And finally we also have a boolean field that denotes whether or not the fixture is finished, so that we can find out whether or not matches are completed. Now that's our models. We also have some dunder string methods. They aren't really important, but there they are. So the next step is we're going to make the migrations. So if we run python manage.py make migrations, that should generate these changes within a migrations file, and then we can use the migrate command to reflect those changes into our database. So that will create the tables for the tournament, the team, and the fixture entities. So now that we've done that, what we're going to do is we're going to populate these database tables, and we're going to use a manage.py script that we've got here called load teams. Now this at the moment is set up to return a not implemented error or raise that error. What we're going to do is get rid of that, and we're going to paste in some more code to generate these teams. Now I have a list of teams here that I've prepared in advance. This contains all of the teams in the English Premier League, and we can paste some more code in here, and we also need to import the models from our application. So if I import the models that we've created, what we're going to do in this function is we create one tournament, a single tournament called Premier League, and then we add the teams from our teams list up here. We check firstly, are there any teams in the database by using the count method. If there are none, then what we do is create a team object for each team within this list, and then we use the bulk create method to create all of those teams in the database. Otherwise, if there are already teams in the database, we simply fetch them with team.objects.all. And the next step is we create a bunch of fixtures from all of these teams. So what we do here is we are using the Python range function and we're skipping 2 teams each time. And we get the index of iteration and we create a fixture object containing the team at index I and the team at index I+1. And we also attach the tournament to that fixture instance as well. And what we do is we use the I+1 syntax to get the next team in the list, and because we're skipping by 2, there's a step size of 2 in our range function. That means that we don't overlap any teams. So the first 2 teams will be these 2, I will be 0 and then I+1 will be 1, and then we skip forward 2 using the step size and range to get the next 2 teams, and that's how we get no overlapping teams within these fixtures. And once we've created this list of fixtures, we're appending each one of these to that list. We finally use the bulk create method to actually create the fixtures. And we also need to add a line here, and that's going to be set that to team.objects.all. that will refresh the teams from the database and it will have their primary keys. We need that when we run fixture.objects.bulk create. So if I now run this command, it's python manage.py load teams, you should find that that loads the teams into the database, and you can verify that in the shell if you want, or you can use SQLite browser. So if I use shell plus and I look at team.objects.all, you see we get a bunch of team instances, and it's the same for fixture.objects.all. We can look at that too, and we get a bunch of fixtures back that we have created. So if we now run the server, we're going to see what we've got so far in this application. If I refresh this here, you should see we have a scores tab in the nav bar. It doesn't currently do anything. So what we want to do is build out that fixtures page, and we're going to create a URL and a view to do that. So let's go to our urls.py file. I'm going to paste in another path here, and this path links to a view called fixtures, so we're going to create that in the views.py file just now. So let's define a fixtures function, and it's going to take the request object, and what we're going to do is we're going to fetch all the fixtures from the database, fixture.objects.all, and we need to import the fixture model to do this. So from our models we'll import fixture, and once we have that, we're going to create a context dictionary that has fixtures as a key, and it references all of the fixture objects. And finally we return the render method, and we're going to render a template that we haven't yet created, and that template's going to be called fixtures.html, and we'll attach our context as a third parameter here. Let's now create this fixture, fixtures.html here, and we go to the templates directory and create a new file. Firstly, we're going to extend the base.html, so extends base.html, and that defines a block that we need to create called content. And what we're going to do within that block is we're going to define the fixtures. So I'm just going to render out for now the fixtures. Remember, we're passing fixtures to our context, and now let's wire up the navbar to show this page. So if we go to the navbar, we're going to copy this URL here, and we'll paste it into the scores section here, and we'll reference the URL called fixtures, which remember we have created here. It's got that name, fixtures. So if we go back to the front end and refresh, and we go to the scores page, we're not actually seeing anything at the moment, so we're going to find out why that is. So the reason we're not seeing any fixtures is because I've misspelled this here. It should be fixtures, not fixture. So that's what's referenced in the context. So if we save that and run the server again, we should now see, hopefully, that we have some fixtures on this page. Now currently this doesn't look anything like what we want, but it is a start. So what we're going to do now is we're going to style this page, and we're going to use the BBC scores and fixtures section here. This is the kind of look that we're going to try and replicate on our page. So let's build up that page now. Within our fixtures.html, we're going to add more code here. So let's get rid of this fixtures block here, and I'm going to create a main tag. And within that main tag, we're going to try and replicate what's on the BBC page here. And we're going to start by building out this header here. So let's paste into that field here an h2 tag, and it's going to look at the first fixture in the query set, and it's going to follow the foreign key to that tournament and the name of the tournament. So it's going to display the name of the tournament along with the message scores and fixtures. So if we save that and refresh the page here, we should see that we get Premier League scores and fixtures. So let's split the screen so we can see live updates as we change things here. And the next thing we're going to build is this search bar at the top here. We're not going to use this until the next tutorial, but let's build it in here. And I'm going to paste this code here. It's a form that wraps a text input. So if I save that and we go back here and refresh, you see we now get a search box at the top of the page. And finally, what we're going to build is this section here where we have the home team on the left along with the number of goals, and the away team are on the right along with their number of goals. So to do that, what I'm going to do is use this code here. We define a div that has an ID, and within that div we are including another template that we're going to create in a second. It's called fixtures_list.html. Now it's important that you define this separately because we're going to use the HTML within this template to return that every time HTMX polls our backend. So we need a separation here. So let's now create that template now within the partials directory. We're going to call it fixtures_list.html. So partials fixtures_list.html. And within this template, we're going to use a template for loop to iterate over all of the fixtures in our context and render them out. So let's paste that code in here, and you see we have a surrounding div, then we use a for loop to iterate over all the fixtures, and we have on the left hand side the fixtures home team and the number of goals they scored. And then we use Bootstrap's column 6 to divide this into two columns. The column on the left, we use the text right class to push everything to the right, and the text left class on the other column to push it to the left. On the right hand column we have the away goals and the away team, and then underneath that we have a template if statement which checks whether or not the game is finished, and if it is finished we have a centered bit of text that simply says FT, which stands for full time. So let's see how that looks on our front end. If we refresh this page now, we see that we get what we desire, and we have a system here that has two columns using Bootstrap. As I said, on the left we have this here, and it's pushed right to the right hand side of that column, which is why it's here. And on the other hand, we have a right hand column where everything is pushed to the left so that it aligns nicely with the other column. So now that we're at this stage, we're going to add some HTMX attributes to this to poll the backend for updates to our fixtures. Now we're going to add some HTMX attributes to the fixtures.html file. Now they're going to be added to this div here that surrounds the partial that we're including. We're going to add the hxget attribute, and it's going to be we're going to use the URL template tag to go to the fixtures URL. So the HTMX request will go to the fixtures URL, which you can see here. It's called fixtures, and that is sent to this view here that we've already created. We're going to change this view to deal with HTMX requests in just a second. So that's the URL we're going to send the request to. This is the polling request. To do polling, we use hxtrigger, and there's a special event in HTMX called every, and we're going to say every 5 seconds in this case. So every 5 seconds we send a get request to this URL. That's basically what that means. And finally we're going to add hxswap=inner_HTML. This is actually the default, but I'm just going to add it to be explicit. So if we go to our front end and refresh, we see that HTMX is now sending a request every 5 seconds to the back end. You see that AJAX request being sent here. Now there is an issue, and that's that the backend is returning the entire fixtures.html. So we don't want to do that. What we want to actually return is we want to return this partial, the fixture list that iterates over the fixtures, because we're going to update these fixtures and return new results, the fresh results to the front end. So we want to only return this fragment if it's an HTMX request. Currently what the fixtures view is doing is returning the entire fixtures.html. The way to solve this is we want to say if the request originates from HTMX, we're going to return the fixture list, and we can render that particular HTML file here. Otherwise we want to just return the normal fixtures.html. So if it's an HTMX request, we return the partial, otherwise we return the entire template. And request.htmx, this attribute is added by the Django HTMX package. So if we check that out in the front end now, we go back to the front end and refresh the page, we should no longer see that that thing at the top where it was replicating the navbar, and you should see on the network tab we should be getting requests being sent every 5 seconds. So this is working as we expect. So what we're now going to do is build a manage.py command that will allow us to change these results as if it was coming in real time. So within our project here, the scores app, we have a management and a commands directory. We're going to create a new command in here called resultgenerator.py, and I'm going to paste this code in, and we'll walk through it very quickly. This is not critical to the actual application, but it's interesting to see what this code is doing. So what I'm doing is we iterate over 10 times and we sleep for a random integer amount of seconds between 1 and 6. After sleeping, we select another random integer to see how many fixtures do we want to update in this iteration. And then what we do is we select a bunch of fixtures from the database where the game is not finished, and then we select a random order of those fixtures, and we can use order by question mark in Django to get a random ordering of a query set. Once we have a random order, we can slice into that with the random integer that we selected up here to get a random number of these fixtures between 1 and 6. And then we call two class functions, two instance functions, self.updateFixtures and self.isGameFinished. Update fixtures is very simple. It takes in the query set, it iterates over each model in the query set, and it changes the home and the away goals by a random integer, either 1 or 2. Finally, after it changes the values on the model, it will use the bulk update function to save that to the database. And the isGameFinished function will, with a probability of 0.3, mark a game as being finished. So for each fixture in the query set passed to the function, we select a random number uniformly between 0 and 1. And if that number happens to be less than 0.3, we say that this game is finished and we save it to the database. So this generator, because it sleeps in between each iteration, it basically simulates scores being changed somewhat at random, and that is fine for the purposes of our application. So let's now run this script, and we need to keep the server running while we do this. So on a separate terminal, I'm going to run python manage.py. The name of the manage.py script was result generator. So if we run that and go back to our front end, we still see this polling going on, but now we see we're actually getting updated results. For example, this game at the top, it finished 1-1 and it's full time now. Other results will update at each iteration of that script. And in between the iterations, remember, it's sleeping, so we don't see a constant stream of updates. But we do see every time the HTMX polls the backend, these results are changing. And by the end of that script, we get some crazy results such as 14 each here between Arsenal and Wolves. Not quite so realistic, but that's not the point of this tutorial. So the final part of this first video, what we're going to do is we're going to optimize the polling a little bit to prevent unnecessary load on the server. Now, what I mean by that is that imagine that you have this set of fixtures and they're all finished. You don't want to keep polling the backend because nothing is going to change when the fixtures are all finished. That's the final scores, and we don't need to keep polling for updates. Polling can cause a lot of stress on your server if you do it too much, so we want to avoid that wherever possible. So how can we remedy this? So the first step is to detect when all the fixtures are finished. So we're going to go to our views.py file here. Within views.py, once we fetch the fixtures here, we can check if all are completed. And we are going to create another variable called allCompleted, and we're going to use the Python built-in all function to do this. And we're going to check if f.gameFinished for f in fixtures. So for all of the fixtures that we're pulling out of the database, we are going to check, are all of them finished? And if that evaluates to true, we know that all of the games are finished. And we can add this variable to our context as well. So I'm just going to copy this here, and we add a key called allCompleted that is going to be set to true or false. So now that we have that in the context, what we can do is within the template, so within this fixtures.html template, we don't want to use the HTMX attributes for polling if all the games are finished. So what we can do is we can set up an if statement within the template. If all completed, which remember is what is being passed down in the context here, all completed. If all games are completed, I want to just render out an empty div, because we don't want to do any polling, so we don't need to attach the HTMX attributes. Otherwise, if all the games are not completed, we do want to actually attach the HTMX attributes. So we'll end the if statement here. So let's just walk through this quickly. If all the matches are completed, we just use a div, and we better attach the same ID here actually. Otherwise, if all the games are not completed, we want to keep doing the polling because we still might get changes. So we attach these HTMX attributes in that case. So what happens now is if I refresh the page, we get an empty results list, which is not what we want, and that's because I've made a mistake here. The end if statement should actually come after the div that we're declaring here. It should be put in there, so I'll just fix the indentation a bit here. The reason for that is because we are just changing the div here that we're actually creating. We don't need to change the include. We still want to include the fixtures, we just don't want to poll for updates. So if I save that and we refresh the page again, we get these fixtures back, but because they're all completed, we are no longer going to see any more requests being sent to poll for updates. Now there is one final issue with this. What we've done now, it will work if you refresh the page and all the matches are finished. However, if you're already on the page and then the matches become finished at some point after that, because when you send an HTMX request, it doesn't return this fixtures template where we've got these changes. It actually returns the fixture list, which is swapped in. Then there is no way of re-rendering this template to stop the polling happening, if that makes sense. I think this is a bit clearer in the blog post, so check that out if you're a bit confused. But what we want to do is we want to trigger a refresh of this page whenever we detect that the last fixture is completed. Now we only want to do this when it's an HTMX request. We want to refresh the page so that this block here is actually fired and we don't render the polling attributes, but we only want to do that when it's an HTMX request, because if it is an HTMX request, we know that we're dealing with a polling request. Therefore, if all games are finished, we should refresh the page so that we don't attach these attributes here. That's a bit convoluted, but let's see what I mean now. If we go to views.py, what we're going to do is within the block that says if request.htmx, we're going to add another check. So if it's an HTMX request, we're going to now check if all completed is true, and remember that's the line up here. And if we have all completed games within an HTMX request, I want to trigger a client-side refresh of the page. And you can do this with an HTMX response header. So what we want to do is we want to render this here as response. So response will be equal to rendering that. And finally, we want to attach a particular header called hxrefresh. And this is an HTTP header that's attached to the response. And we set it to true and it will trigger a client-side refresh. And finally we return the response from this block here. Now importantly, if it's an HTMX request but this evaluates to false, we just return the partial as normal. We don't trigger a client-side refresh because we don't need to. We only trigger that refresh so that this block here evaluates to true and we don't attach the HTMX attributes for polling. So let's now see how to do that. So I'm going to bring back PowerShell here and we're going to run the shell plus command from Django extensions. And I'm going to mark one of the fixtures as being not completed. So fixture.objects.first, let's get the first fixture and we'll say f.gameFinished equals false and we'll save that instance. So now if we go to the front end and refresh this page, you see that the first fixture here is not completed. And because that's the case, we are going to start polling for updates again. You see that these requests are coming in again on the network tab of the developer tools. Now what I want to show you is what happens when we make this fixture completed. HTMX is still going to poll the back end, but when it does, it will enter this if statement and it will enter this if statement as well, because now all the matches are completed and it's going to render out that partial and it's going to set this HTTP header on the response, and this header will trigger a client-side refresh. And you can find out more about these response headers in the HTMX documentation, which you can see here. I'll link this in the description. Now what we want to do is we want to go back to the shell and we're going to mark this game as being finished again. So f.gameFinished equals true. When I then call f.save here, I want to quickly go back to the front end and we should see a refresh of this page. Now it refreshes and we no longer get the polling. Hopefully you've seen that. It refreshed the page and we no longer get the polling request. So that's quite subtle. It's worth working through this example yourself to see how that works. But hxrefresh is a header you can add to your response to trigger a client-side refresh if you need to. And that's very useful functionality to know about. Now finally, don't be polling the server every 10 milliseconds or something. You should only poll every, let's say, 30 seconds to a minute for sports scores, because they don't update that often. There's no point in overwhelming your server with requests if nothing is going to change that often. So use a sensible polling interval when you're making these requests in your own applications. So that covers everything in this video. In the next video, we're going to build out this search bar here, and we're going to give users the ability to search and filter down these results. We're also going to add an HX indicator element, and that's going to be a spinner that shows whenever HTMX is polling the backend for updates. So that gives users more feedback so they can see when results might be changing. So thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, and there'll be plenty more content on Django and HTMX in the near future. And if you want more detailed information about this content, check out the blog post, which is linked in the description, and the code from GitHub will also be in the description. So thanks again, and we'll see you in the next video.